In a climate-controlled vault beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum, it waits. There is a fragment of clay there no larger than the palm of a hand. Its catalog number is CBS10673. Its surface is rough-pitted, weathered by 4,000 years of survival. Across that roughness run wedge-shaped impressions, lines pressed into wet mud at a time when Egypt's pyramids were already old. A reed stylus touched this clay. A human hand pressed these marks. The pressure dried, the clay hardened, and what was written remained. You cannot hold it. I cannot hold it. It rests behind layers of protection, behind security, behind careful regulation of temperature and humidity. But if you could hold it, if for one moment the museum allowed the distance between past and present to collapse, you would feel fired earth in your hand. Cool, heavy, denser than you would expect. You would feel the chipped edges where some collapse long ago broke a larger hole into the fragment that survives now. The tablet was excavated from Nippur in the 1890s, taken from the ruins of what had once been the religious heart of Sumer, the first literate civilization we know. For decades after it was found, it sat only partly translated, one more text among thousands, one more creation account, one more flood story to place beside Noah, beside Utnapishtim, beside the old human instinct to explain catastrophe by beginning again. It could have remained that. Just another myth, just another ancient voice filed away under religion and literature. But there is a line on this tablet, written in Sumerian cuneiform, that refuses to stay quiet. It describes the world after the flood. It speaks of kingship descending from heaven a second time. It speaks of human beings made after the waters receded. And yet the language suggests something unsettling. These post-flood humans are not simply the same people beginning again. They are different somehow, made differently, from different origins. That is the question, not a question added by us, a question already there in the clay. And before we go further, pause for a moment. If you want to quietly, almost as a way of marking your place in this chain of listeners' note, where in the world you are hearing this from and what time it is there now. This is a story about distance, about deep time, about records carried forward. It matters in its own way that you are here too, because this story stretches across 6,000 years and arrives improbably inside your own genome. And what makes CBS 10673 so unsettling is not merely what the tablet says, it is what modern genetics now confirms, not symbolically, not poetically, literally. Human beings alive today carry DNA from multiple ancestral sources. If your ancestry is European, Asian, or Oceanic, then parts of your genome come from Neanderthals, a distinct hominin population. If your ancestry reaches into Melanesia or parts of Asia, then other segments come from Denisovans, another separate group. In Africa, there are markers from archaic populations whose names we do not even know. The record is incomplete. The ancestry is not. We are genetically speaking mixtures, a mosaic, a convergence, a species with different ancestral streams flowing into one body. And the Sumerians wrote as if they knew this. Not in one tablet only, not in one isolated line, in text after text, copied and recopied across centuries, now scattered through museums in Philadelphia, London, Paris, Baghdad, Oxford. They described human beings created in stages produced through mixtures distinguished by varying compositions. They wrote of rulers who were part divine and part human. They wrote of pre-flood and post-flood populations as though they were not simply separated by time, but by nature. They wrote of particular individuals shaped for wisdom or understanding or extraordinary ability, as though some humans had been made with one kind of inheritance and some with another. For more than a century, scholars have mostly placed these descriptions safely inside mythology. And that is understandable. Myth is the safe category. Myth is the category that asks the least of us. If it is myth, then the problem is solved before it begins. We can admire the poetry, we can analyze the symbolism, we can note the political theology, and then we can file it away. But what if the Sumerians were not inventing in the way we assume myth invents? What if they were recording? What if they were not writing what they imagined, but what they had been told, what they had inherited, what earlier record keepers had already preserved? What if these tablets are not creation myths in the modern dismissive sense, but creation records in an ancient documentary sense? The difference is enormous. It is the difference between a story about the moon and a transcript from Apollo 11. Both speak of the same object. Only one claims to be memory. This investigation does not begin by declaring that possibility true. It begins more carefully, more slowly. It begins by asking what happens if we take the tablets seriously on their own terms. What happens if we read them as the Sumerians likely read them, as records, as accounts, as preserved knowledge? What happens if we compare those descriptions to what modern genetics has only recently made visible? What happens if we stop assuming that ancient people were necessarily less informed than we are, and allow for the possibility that they may have been informed about different things? So we will follow the evidence where it leads. We will look at the physical tablets at their catalog numbers and museum locations. We will look at the creation procedures in texts such as Atrahasis and Enki and Ninmah. We will look at the Sumerian king list and its rulers whose lifespans and ancestries seem to fall outside ordinary human expectation. We will look at the flood traditions that divide history into before and after. We will look at Adapa and Gilgamesh. We will look at the Apkallu, the seven sages. We will look at the modern genetic studies of populations in southern Iraq, including the Iraqi marsh Arabs, whose lineages may preserve something of that ancient world. We will present the mainstream interpretations fairly. We will mark what cannot be known. We will distinguish documented fact from speculation. But we will not dismiss evidence simply because it disturbs the comfort of familiar narratives. Because the question is no longer whether humans have different origins in their DNA. Modern science has answered that already. Yes, unequivocally, yes. The deeper question is whether the Sumerians knew, and if they knew how the vault is quiet. The tablet waits in its controlled atmosphere, patient, in the way only clay can be patient. The marks remain where the stylus pressed them in the 17th century before the Common Era. The scribes are gone. Their city is broken. Their language survives only in reconstruction. But the record remains, and that record describes something modern laboratories are now discovering as well, that humanity was never one pure line, but a convergence of several. That what we call human is in part inheritance from more than one source. The evidence waits, the tablet speaks, The DNA answers. The only question is whether we are willing to follow where the two seem to meet. So we begin where we must begin, with the people who made these records, and with one of the oldest, strangest ideas they preserved, that humanity may not have been made once in a single act, but through stages, through attempts, through variation, through experiment. The contest between Enki and Ninmah deserves to be read slowly, not because it is obscure, though parts of it are, not because it is fragmentary, though the surviving tablets are broken, but because what it describes is not creation as one clean event. It is creation as process, creation as trial, creation as variation, creation as something closer to repeated procedure than to instantaneous miracle. The principal fragments come from Nippur, the great scribal center, where so much of Sumerian literature was copied by students learning cuneiform. The text survives in multiple versions, copied across long stretches of time. Details shift, phrases differ, some lines are damaged, but the core sequence remains stable enough to matter. Humans have already been made. That is important. The first successful workers already exist. In the Atrahasis tradition, they are the beings created to relieve the gods of labor. But after that initial success, the story does not end. It turns unexpectedly toward a contest. There has been a feast. Beer has been consumed. The atmosphere is almost convivial. And in that setting, Ninmah begins to make variant human beings, each marked by a particular impairment or deficiency. Enki, in turn, must show that each one can still be given a place, a role, a function within human society. The first being cannot control his urine. The language of the text is direct, anatomical, not vague. The second is a woman who cannot conceive. In a society dependent on fertility, that is no small detail. The third possesses ambiguous or absent genitalia, neither male nor female in the ordinary sense. The fourth cannot walk properly. The fifth cannot retain seed, likely a reference to male fertility or sexual function. The sixth is burdened with multiple impairments severe enough to make ordinary independent life difficult. And what is striking is not only that these forms are described, it is the manner of their description. They are not treated as accidents that occurred later in a fallen world. They emerge from the creation process itself. Ninmah shapes them deliberately. Enki responds not by discarding them, but by assigning them places. One is set in a role where continence is not required. Another is placed among the queen's weaving women, where her labor still contributes, though she produces no children. The being of ambiguous sex is given a position at court. Again and again, the text insists in its matter-of-fact way that variation does not eliminate social value. Read one way, this is an extraordinarily early text about disability and accommodation. It acknowledges human difference. It refuses to erase those whose bodies do not fit the standard pattern. It suggests that society can make room for forms that deviate from expectation. That reading is real humane and powerful. But the story contains another layer as well, one harder to ignore once seen. Because if the text is preserving memory of literal creation, or even of a tradition that spoke of literal creation, then what Ninmah is doing is not merely symbolic. She is varying the design. She is producing altered outcomes. Some remain viable, some can function in limited contexts, some push against the edge of what can sustain life. In modern language, we would speak of mutation, variation, phenotype, viability. And then Enki creates a being of his own. Here, the tablet becomes more damaged, but enough survives to establish the point. Enki's creation is profoundly impaired. It cannot speak. It cannot feed itself. It cannot sit upright. It cannot respond in the ways expected. Ninmah examines it and says in effect that she cannot determine its fate. She cannot assign it a place. Enki has produced something beyond the threshold of function. That matters, because it introduces a boundary, a line. The text is no longer only about divine creativity. It is about limits. It is about how far variation can go before form collapses into non-viability. Even in this mythic setting, creation is delicate. It can fail, and the tone at the end darkens. There is curse or lament or warning. The exact wording is debated because the text is damaged, but the mood is unmistakable. Push creation too far, and consequences remain. There are things that should perhaps not be made. That is not the language of effortless omnipotence. It is the language of craft, of procedure, of trial and error, of difficult work performed in obscurity with no guarantee of success. Enki himself, in surviving lines, speaks as though making humans is painstaking labor. The shaping happens in darkness. It requires precision. It requires skill. It requires repeated effort. This does not sound like a god speaking the world into being with a word. It sounds more like a technician describing a fragile process in which errors are possible and outcomes vary. And once that possibility enters the text, it changes the entire frame. If human diversity was present at creation, then it is not later corruption. It is inherent. If humans were produced through attempts, refinements, and selections, then the successful human form is itself the result of prior variation, not the first thing made, the chosen thing made. This resonates uneasily with what modern genetics tells us. Variation is the raw material of selection. Mutations occur constantly. Most are neutral, some are harmful. A few become advantageous in the right context. Populations survive, not through perfect sameness, but through diversity. The Sumerian text does not describe evolution in scientific terms. It does not speak of genes. But it describes purposeful variation differential outcomes and the identification of viable versus non-viable forms. It describes in ancient terms a world in which humanity is not a single perfect prototype repeated endlessly, but a spectrum emerging through process. Archaeology gives this another kind of grounding. Burials from ancient Mesopotamia include people with congenital conditions, with healed fractures, with impairments that would have required long-term care. They were not all abandoned. They lived. They were cared for. They were buried with attention. The social accommodation implied in Enki and Ninmah is not separate from ancient reality. It mirrors it. But the creation narratives go further still. The successful first humans in the Atrahasis account are 14 in number 7 male, 7 female. Whether taken literally or symbolically, that is a small founding population, a constrained beginning, a bottleneck. All later humans descend from that small initial set. Again, the text is not doing population genetics, but the shape of the idea is striking. Modern studies of human ancestry show that living populations descend from relatively small ancestral groups whose surviving lineages passed through bottlenecks. Not because there were only one man and one woman alive, but because only certain lines persisted into the present. The Sumerian account imagines something similar in narrative form, a narrow founder group from which later humanity expands. And then importantly, the story does not end there either. Because the Sumerian world does not imagine humanity as fixed after first creation. Gods continue to interact with humans. Gods mate with human women. Hybrid offspring appear. The gene pool, to use modern language for an ancient idea, is supplemented, altered, infused again with something outside the original human line. That is why figures like Gilgamesh matter so much. Not yet because of who he is, but because of what he represents ancestry that can be measured fractionally. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. A formulation that makes little sense if all of this is only decorative poetry, but begins to sound strangely coherent if ancestry is being imagined as something transmissible, quantifiable, inherited. So, before we move to kings and genealogies, we have to sit for a moment with what the creation texts have already established. Human beings are made in stages. Human beings vary. Some forms are viable, and some are not. The first successful population is small. Later mixtures continue to alter the line. This is not a simple tale. It is not even a simple myth. It is a model, strange, ancient, and unsettlingly systematic. And once you notice that system, once you see that the Sumerians were thinking not only about who humans were, but how humans were made and remade, the next documents begin to look different too, especially the king lists, especially the names attached to impossible lifespans, especially the rulers who seem over and over again not entirely human. The Sumerian king list is one of those documents that becomes stranger the longer you remain with it. At first glance, it seems straightforward. A sequence of rulers, names, cities, durations of reign, formula after formula repeated with the steady rhythm of administrative record-keeping in this city. This man became king. He ruled this many years. Then the kingship passed elsewhere. It exists in multiple copies and fragments dating from the late 3rd millennium into the early 2nd millennium BCE. The most famous surviving manuscript, the Weld-Blundell Prism, rests today in Oxford. For the later periods, much of it looks familiar to historians. Names align with archaeological evidence. Some kings are independently attested in inscriptions and monuments. Their reigns, while sometimes schematic or rounded, fall within plausible human limits. Their history and text seem to touch, but the list does not begin there. It begins before the flood, and before the flood, the numbers become impossible. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Ululim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled for 36,000 years. Then other cities follow Bad Tabir al-Arak, Sipar, Shurapak. 8 kings in all before the flood, with reigns stretching from 18,000 to more than 40,000 years. The total extends beyond 241,000 years. Then comes the dividing line. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, the kingship was in Kish. That phrase matters. A second time. Not continuity only, re-beginning, reset. And after the flood, the reign lengths diminish, though they remain extraordinary at first. A king rules for 1,200 years, another for 960. Over time, the numbers continue to decline, until by the early historical period, kings rule for decades rather than centuries. And the record begins to resemble what we would expect from ordinary human life. The standard interpretation is familiar enough. The antediluvian section is myth. The long rains signify immense antiquity. The world before the flood was not like the world after. It was an age of gods and heroes, and the impossible numbers express that difference symbolically. The gradual shortening of rains marks decline from a golden age. That reading is reasonable, but it leaves two things unresolved. First, the numbers are not random exaggerations. They are mathematically structured in the Sumerian sexagesimal system. Many are multiples of 3,600, the SAR, a fundamental numerical unit. Alulim's 28,800 years are 8 SAR. Al-Algar's 36,000 are 10 SAR. Enmenluana's 43,200 are 12 SAR. This is not loose storytelling, it is precise calculation. Why preserve mathematical precision inside what is supposed to be mere symbolic fantasy? Second, the list itself never tells you where myth ends and history begins. It does not announce a genre shift. It does not say what follows now is fictional, and what follows after that is reliable. It presents one continuous sequence. Kingship descends. Cities hold it. The flood interrupts it. Kingship descends again. The line continues. The flood is the division the text cares about, not the modern scholarly line between myth and history. That should make us pause. Because if the text treats pre-flood and post-flood kings as belonging to one continuous order of reality, then the impossible reign lengths are not simply decorative. They are part of a deeper claim that the beings who ruled before the flood were different kinds of rulers, and perhaps different kinds of humans. Then there is Ziusudra, the flood hero. In some traditions, he is the king of Shuruppak, or the son of its king. In the Eridu Genesis, he is chosen to survive. After the flood, he is granted eternal life and taken away, removed from ordinary humanity into a paradisal land. That detail is easy to read mythologically. It is also, if read genealogically, a bridge. He stands between worlds. The old line passes through him into the new. And if it passes through him, then the post-flood kings inherit something from the pre-flood world, even if diminished. That pattern inheritance with dilution appears again and again. Nowhere more clearly than in Gilgamesh. The king list names him as the 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty. His reign is given as 126 years long, certainly, but no longer absurd by the standards of the earlier sections. Yet, his parentage is crucial. Other texts describe his mother as the goddess Ninsun. His father, Lugalbanda, is himself an unusual figure, a king associated with extraordinary feats, and a reign of 1,200 years in the list. And, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one description is repeated with remarkable insistence. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Not half divine, not nearly divine, not godlike. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. That precision is strange. Too strange, perhaps, to dismiss easily as hyperbole. Why not simply say he is mostly divine? Why assign fractions at all? If ancestry is imagined as substance, the formula begins to make sense. If Lugalbanda was already partly divine, and Ninsun fully divine, then Gilgamesh could be imagined as carrying an inherited proportion greater than half. The exact arithmetic is not the point. The point is that the text thinks in terms of transmissible ancestral composition, And once that possibility appears, Gilgamesh becomes something other than a mere heroic exaggeration. He becomes a case study in inherited difference. His body is described as exceptional. His strength is beyond the ordinary. His endurance, his stature, his mind, all exceed normal expectation. The language can be poetic, yes. Epics speak in magnified terms. But across the traditions, the cause of his exceptionality is not vague. It is ancestry. He is what he is because of what he comes from. That same logic underlies the Sumerian obsession with genealogy. Kings trace their descent carefully. Inscriptions name fathers, grandfathers, old heroic lines. This is often explained as political legitimation, and of course it is that. But political legitimation only works because the culture already believes blood matters. Lineage matters. Descent matters. Not just symbolically, substantively. Royal lines are guarded. Marriages are strategic. The point is not simply power in the immediate sense. It is continuity of a particular kind of inheritance. If certain lines carry something superior, divine blood, heroic blood, exceptional blood, then preserving that line is not only political. It is biological in concept, even if expressed mythologically. The king list taken this way becomes not a chronology of impossible reigns, but a record of diminishing inheritance. Antediluvian rulers possess the strongest concentration of the old extraordinary ancestry. After the flood, that inheritance persists but weakens. Lifespans shorten, capacities decline. By the historical era, kings still claim divine descent, but it is remote, attenuated, thin. That pattern is familiar in another register too. Modern humans carry archaic ancestry in unequal proportions. Not everyone inherits the same amount. Different populations preserve different traces. Over time, admixture dilutes what was once stronger in first-generation hybrids. The principle is simple. Even when the details are complex, inheritance can persist while diminishing. The Sumerian texts describe exactly that in their own language. They do not say Neanderthal, they do not say Denisovan, they say divine and human. They say before and after the flood. They say kingship descended twice. They say some rulers were not quite like later rulers. They say ancestry altered lifespan, capacity, authority. And so the question returns again, as it must. Are these only metaphors for power? Or are they records of observed difference preserved in the conceptual categories available to the scribes? The king list does not answer that directly. It only deepens the problem. Because once rulers can be fractionally divine, once ancient populations can differ in nature rather than merely in date, once a flood can separate one kind of humanity from another, the next figure becomes almost inevitable. A being not merely born into an unusual lineage, but made for wisdom, made as a model, made and then denied the one thing that would have made him equal to those who made him. Adapa waits at that threshold, and with Adapa, the question of what the Sumerians believed about human design becomes more difficult to avoid. Among the tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh is a damaged fragment catalogued as K.8214. By itself, it tells only part of the story. Other fragments from Amarna in Egypt and later Assyrian copies fill in more. Taken together, they preserve the narrative of Adapa. And Adapa is unlike an ordinary man from the very beginning. He is not introduced as the son of human parents. He is not placed inside an ordinary genealogy first and then elevated. He is said to have been made by Enki, crafted, formed, designed as a model of men, an exemplar, a prototype. He is given wisdom, understanding, intelligence. But one thing is withheld from him: immortality. That distinction is everything. Wisdom, but not eternal life. Knowledge, but not equality with the gods. Capacity, but not release from death. Adapa serves in Eridu Enki's cult center. He is priest, caretaker, provider. He performs rituals, prepares offerings, catches fish for the temple. He belongs at the edge between the human and the divine, between practical labor and sacred duty. And then in the best-known episode, while fishing on the waters of the Gulf, the south wind overturns his boat. Adapa, enraged, curses it and breaks its wing. The wind ceases for 7 days. The gods notice. Anu summons him to heaven to account for what he has done. Before Adapa goes, Enki warns him. When you stand before Anu, he says, do not eat or drink what is offered to you. You will be given the food and water of death. Refuse them. Adapa obeys, and in that obedience lies the tragedy. Because when he arrives, Anu is impressed by his understanding. The chief god decides to offer him the bread and water, not of death, but of eternal life. Adapa refuses exactly as instructed. Anu is astonished. Why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? And when the truth emerges, it becomes clear that Adapa has lost the gift that would have made him more than he was designed to be. He returns to Earth wise, but mortal. This story is usually placed beside the biblical Adam, and the comparison is understandable. Food, a first or early man, lost immortality, limits placed on human destiny. But the differences matter more than the similarities. Adapa does not lose immortality through rebellion. He loses it through obedience. He is not punished for seeking knowledge. He is created with knowledge. His tragedy is not sin, it is limitation. He discovers, in effect, the boundary built into him. And that is why the story matters for this investigation. Because Adapa is not simply a hero who learns something. He is a being made with a specific endowment and a specific restriction. He is designed for wisdom, not for eternal life. The text is explicit on this point. If read mythologically, this is a profound statement about the human condition. Human beings can know much. They can speak wisely. They can serve the sacred. They can brush against heaven itself. But they remain mortal. They are not gods. Yet if read through the lens, the earlier texts have already opened, another possibility emerges. Adapa is not just humanity in general. He is a special case, an engineered case in narrative form, a being made for a purpose, a successful design in one respect, a limited one in another. Later, Mesopotamian tradition identifies him as the first of the 7 Apkallu, the sages before the flood, who brought civilization to humanity. These sages are not described as ordinary men who learn slowly over time. They are created by Enki. They come from the Abzu, the freshwater deep. They belong to the watery domain of wisdom. In iconography, they are shown in fish cloaks, or with fish attributes, beings who stand at the threshold between worlds. The imagery is strange enough that later writers took it literally. Berossus, the Babylonian priest, writing in Greek centuries later, describes the first of these beings, Oannes, usually identified with a dappa, or his equivalent as a creature with the body of a fish, and beneath the fish's head, another head human with human feet, joined to the tail. The description is morphological, almost anatomical. And this being, Berossus says, emerged from the sea and taught humanity writing law, building agriculture, the arts of civilization, then returned to the water at night. Read symbolically, the fish imagery points to the life-giving waters of Enki's realm. Read historically, it may preserve memory of foreigners arriving by sea, or of beings associated so strongly with water that later generations ceased to distinguish costume from body, symbol from form. Either way, the point remains these teachers were not regarded as ordinary humans. Adapa is first among them, and his defining quality is not piety, but intelligence. Technical intelligence, reasoning capacity, understanding. In modern terms, cognitive endowment. The text does not say he learned wisdom through long study. It says Enki gave it to him. Again, the modern parallel presses itself upon us, not because the ancient text knew genetics in our sense, but because the ancient text thinks in terms that modern genetics has made newly resonant. Some traits are inheritable. Some capacities cluster in lineages. Some populations differ. Hybridization can alter what appears in offspring. These are now scientific propositions. In Sumerian text, they are cosmological propositions. The structure of the thought is not identical. The resemblance is still difficult to ignore. If a distinct population call them gods, call them another human group, call them a more advanced neighboring lineage, interacted with early Mesopotamians, then figures like Adapa could preserve memory of intermediaries. Individuals whose capacities seemed extraordinary relative to surrounding populations. Teachers whose knowledge appeared not gradually acquired, but simply present. Men who looked human enough to converse labor and rule, yet different enough to be placed closer to the divine than to the ordinary. And there is another detail that keeps returning mortality withheld. Why withhold it? In the mythic register, because human beings are not meant to become the gods' equals. In a biological register, the same idea sounds different, but remains recognizable. Enhanced beings may still be constrained. Design may include safeguards. Capabilities may be increased, while other thresholds remain closed. The result is not equality, but controlled difference. That is precisely Adapa's story. He discovers what he is not allowed to become. Later traditions about the sages follow a similar pattern. Before the flood, the Apkallu are closer to the divine source, more distinct, more original. After the flood, the sage tradition continues, but the beings are increasingly described as mixed, partly human, partly descended from the older line. Over generations, dilution sets in. The first forms are not repeated. Their descendants preserve traces. The special inheritance remains, but less purely, less strongly. That is how admixture works. It enters once, then persists in fractions. And so Adapa stands not only as the first wise man, but as the beginning of a process original difference, becoming inherited difference. Pure teacher becoming ancestral line, designed prototype, becoming diluted legacy. He is wise, but not immortal, human, but not ordinary, made, but still limited, a bridge, but never the destination. And if Adapa is the first of the Apkallu, then to understand what the Sumerians thought they had inherited, whether knowledge, bloodline, or both, we have to stay with those 7 beings who came before the flood, who supposedly gave humanity its arts, and who may represent one of the oldest memories in literate history of civilization, not as invention, but as transmission. Before cities rose, before kingship descended a second time, before the flood divided history into before and after, there were 7. That is how the tradition remembers them. The Sumerian term is Abgal. The Akkadian form is Apkallu. 7 sages, 7 wisdom bearers, 7 beings associated with Enki and the Abzu, the watery deep beneath the earth from which knowledge itself seems to rise. They are not remembered as ordinary scholars. They are not remembered as human innovators who slowly discovered things through trial and error. They are remembered as transmitters, teachers, mediators, beings explicitly connected to the origin of civilization. Their names vary slightly across traditions, but the structure remains stable. Adapa stands first. After him come others, each associated with one of the antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurapak, the same cities named in the king list as centers of kingship before the flood. This parallel is important. The sages and the earliest kings belong to the same lost world. And what do the sages do? They teach. Not one art only, but the whole civilizational package. Writing, measurement, law, building, agriculture, ritual, cultic procedure, craft knowledge, the ordering principles of urban life. They are described not as inventors within human society, but as beings who bring knowledge from elsewhere into human society. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian texts treat them as primordial authorities. Priestly knowledge incantations, ritual procedures, scholarly traditions, these are traced back to the Apkallu. Temple libraries preserve their names not as decorative myth, but as source figures, foundations, origins. In visual art, they are unmistakable. Reliefs and seals depict them as fish-cloaked beings, sometimes fully human, beneath the fish covering, sometimes more difficult to classify. They flank doorways. They hold buckets and cone-like implements. They stand as guardians, purifiers beings operating at thresholds. And always there is the water association, the deep, the life-giving and wisdom-giving realm of Enki. The conventional reading is symbolic, and again that reading is not frivolous. Fish signify water. Water signifies fertility, life, the subterranean deep from which order emerges. The sages are wrapped in fish imagery because they mediate that life-giving knowledge into the human world. Symbolically, it works. But the descriptions are oddly specific. Berossus does not merely say that Oannes was associated with fish. He describes a composite being speaking, teaching, living in relation to the sea. This is not the language of abstraction alone. It reads like the memory of something once seen and then retold until the categories hardened around it. What then could the Apkallu represent? One possibility is simple, at least in principle: survivors or representatives of an earlier world. If major floods did reshape Mesopotamian memory, and there is geological evidence for significant inundation events in the region, then survivors carrying pre-existing knowledge might easily become, in later retelling, teachers from before the flood. They would arrive with skills ordinary populations lacked. They would rebuild. They would instruct. And because they came from the waters, or across the waters, they would in memory become beings of the waters. That alone could produce fishmen in cultural memory. Another possibility is external contact. A more knowledgeable group arriving by boat from marshland gulf or coast, so it could seem to inland or less developed populations as people of the sea-bearers of arts and measurements and construction methods that appeared miraculous. Over generations, foreignness hardens into divinity. Instruction hardens into revelation. There is also the more speculative possibility that the Apkallu preserve memory of a genuinely distinct population, one biologically or culturally different enough to be felt as not simply another tribe, not simply another city, but another order of being. The texts, at the very least, keep insisting on this distinction. The sages are not just wise men. They are made by Enki. They come from his domain. They stand between God and human. What is beyond dispute is the model of development the texts imply. Civilization is not discovered independently by scattered humans. It is given, handed down, taught as a whole. Berossus preserves this with startling clarity. Owens teaches letters, sciences, house construction, temple building law, geometry, seeds, fruits, everything necessary, in short, to humanize humankind. And then comes the most astonishing claim. After this teaching, nothing fundamental was added by way of improvement. That is not gradualism, that is transmission. Modern archaeology, of course, generally prefers a different model. Writing emerges from accounting. Cities grow through administrative complexity. Building techniques develop incrementally. Metallurgy evolves from experimentation. And that model has much to support it. Yet even within archaeology, there are moments of acceleration difficult to ignore. Cuneiform moves from proto-writing to a flexible writing system with remarkable speed. Mathematics appears in sophisticated forms early. Urban architecture advances rapidly in certain phases. It is not irrational to ask whether local development was at times catalyzed by concentrated knowledge transfer. The Apkallu would fit that role perfectly. Not supernatural in a modern sense perhaps, but remembered as supernatural, because the difference they represented was too great to express otherwise. There is also a second layer to the tradition, and it matters deeply. After the flood, the Apkallu change. The pure or original sages are gone. In later accounts, post-flood-wise figures are mixed. Partly divine, partly human. No longer wholly of Enki's domain, but descendants inheritors, diluted carriers of the old line. There it is again. The same pattern. Before the flood, stronger difference. After the flood, diluted survival. This is how the Sumerian record keeps thinking. Not just in terms of event, but in terms of changing composition. The flood is not merely a watery catastrophe. It is a break in inheritance. What survives afterward survives in reduced form. That is exactly what genetic admixture over generations produces. First-generation hybrids show marked difference. With repeated backcrossing into a broader population, those original contributions persist, but at lower percentages. Modern humans carry archaic ancestry in this way. It is no longer concentrated as it once was, but it remains. The texts are not scientific. We have to keep saying that. They do not provide genes percentages in our modern sense or laboratory procedure. But they repeatedly describe a world in which special lineages once existed in stronger form, and later humanity carries only partial remnants. The sages stand at the center of that memory. They are the ones who taught, the ones who came before, the ones from another realm, another condition, another inheritance. Whether they were historical teachers, flood survivors, foreigners, hybrids, or mythologized embodiments of cumulative cultural innovation, they function in the same way they explain why civilization appears not as invention, but as received order. And once that model is in place, another Sumerian concept becomes newly important, not a group of beings this time, but a collection of powers, capacities, and civilizational modules that the gods possess, store, transfer, and sometimes steal. The me. Because if the sages are the couriers of civilization, the me are the contents of the package. And the story of how those contents move from one place to another may be one of the clearest statements in all Sumerian literature, that knowledge for them was something tangible, transferable, preservable, something not discovered from nothing, but received from a prior source and carried forward through time. In Sumerian thought, the me are difficult to translate because they sit at the boundary between idea and object. Scholars have called them divine powers, decrees, ordinances, norms. All of those catch part of the meaning. None quite captures the whole, because the me are not merely abstract principles. They can be possessed, stored, handed over, lost, retrieved, stolen, distributed. The texts speak of them as if they are the very components of civilization, modular, countable, transferable. That alone should make us linger. Enki possesses the me. He keeps them in the Abzu, the deep freshwater domain beneath Eridu, at once temple reservoir archive source. The me include kingship priesthood, the throne, the crown judgment law, music, craftsmanship, sexual relations, victory, lamentation, joy, smithing, building, writing, administration, and many other categories. Besides, different lists preserve different emphases, but the overall impression is constant. The ME are the total architecture of ordered life. The most famous narrative involving them is the story of Inanna and Enki. Inanna travels to Eridu. Enki welcomes her. There is feasting. Beer flows. In his intoxicated generosity, or perhaps through a deeper inevitability disguised as drunkenness, Enki repeatedly grants Inanna clusters of the me. Again and again she asks. Again and again he bestows. She loads them onto her boat and departs for Uruk. When Enki sobers, he realizes what has happened and sends his minister to retrieve them. The pursuit passes through multiple stopping points. At each one the demand is made, return the me. And at each one, Inanna refuses. A gift given cannot be ungiven. In the end, she reaches Uruk with the me, and Enki accepts the transfer. Read politically, the story is elegant. Cultural prestige shifts from old Eridu to rising Uruk. Religious and political authority move from one center to another. That reading is sound. But once again, the text seems to be saying something more concrete at the same time. The me are loaded onto a boat. That detail is strange if they are only symbolic principles. One does not physically transport abstract ideas in crates and bundles. Yet the story insists on transport, pursuit, possession, transfer. Enki keeps them somewhere. Inanna takes them somewhere else. Whoever holds them gains the capacities they represent. In modern terms, the closest parallel is information storage, blueprints, archives, libraries, technical manuals, instructional corpora. Possess the data, and you possess the ability to enact what the data contains. If the MEE for kingship are present, a city knows how to organize power. If the ME for metallurgy are present, it knows how to work metal. If the ME for writing are present, it knows the system, the signs, the procedures of literacy. The me become in this reading not mystical abstractions, but organized knowledge modules. That interpretation matters because it changes how we understand Sumerian claims about cultural origins. Civilization is not assembled from scratch each time by slow, independent invention. Civilization exists already in the form of transmissible packages of knowledge. It can be moved from one place to another. One city can gain what another city possessed. One domain can lose what another receives. That is diffusion, yes. But diffusion understood not vaguely, not as accidental seepage over centuries, but as deliberate transfer. The list of me in the texts reinforces this. They cover the full spectrum of complex social life. Not just tools, but institutions. Not just crafts, but statuses. Not just technologies, but emotional and ceremonial frameworks. Law, music, building, sexuality, kingship, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the art of heroism, the art of destruction, straightforwardness, treachery, lamentation, rejoicing. These are not random. They are the components by which a human population becomes a civilization. And crucially, writing itself is one of the me. Writing is not discovered in the story, it is transferred. That detail is difficult to overlook. Archaeology shows writing emerging in the late Uruk period through developmental stages. Proto-cuneiform begins as a counting notation. Signs grow more abstract. Phonetic values appear. In material terms, this looks like innovation, yet the speed of maturation remains remarkable. Within a relatively narrow span, the system becomes capable of complex expression. Could local invention explain that? Certainly. Could a pre-existing conceptual framework, a me for writing, so to speak, have accelerated it? The text itself leaves that possibility open. The same is true for mathematics. Sumerian numerical reasoning appears in sophisticated form, very early, place value calculation tables, geometrical procedures. Again, archaeology traces development. Again, the texts imagine possession and transfer of knowledge as the underlying model. Not creation from nothing, but access to something already held. The me also operate at a cosmic level. The order of the world itself follows me. The sun's path, the flow of rivers, the functioning of social roles, the maintenance of ritual, everything operates according to proper principles. In that sense, the me resemble laws of reality as much as laws of society. To know them is to know how the world works. To possess them is to act effectively within it. This is why the Abzu matters. Enki's domain is both watery deep and archive of principles. It is where the underlying code of reality and civilization is stored. The Apkallu draw from it. Inanna obtains from it. Cities rise or fall according to their relation to it. And after the flood, the logic continues. If the flood destroys the old world, what must be preserved for the new one to begin again? Seeds, animals, a surviving line of humans, and also knowledge, the me. Without those modules, there is no restart, no rebuilding of temples, no reestablishment of kingship, no continuation of law and ritual and writing. If the flood is reset, then the ME are the preserved continuity. That makes them, in another sense, a memory technology. The me are what let civilization survive rupture. And this returns us to the larger question. If the Sumerians continually say they did not invent, but received, if they describe knowledge as transfer rather than spontaneous discovery, then the self-conception of the civilization is clear. They are inheritors, not originators, recipients of an older order. Modern cultures usually tell themselves a different story. We like invention. We like the image of gradual progress generated from within. Sumer often tells the opposite story. We were taught. The components came from elsewhere. Wisdom came down. The package was given. That does not have to mean the story is literally supernatural. It may preserve memories of libraries, priestly lineages, external contacts, organized knowledge traditions, or flood-surviving archives. But even in the most naturalistic reading, the core point stands: the Sumerians thought civilization was transmissible before it was innovative. And once knowledge becomes something transferable, the question of who is fit to carry it becomes equally urgent. Who receives it? Who preserves it? Who embodies it? That is where bloodline enters again. Because for the Sumerians, knowledge and ancestry do not remain separate concerns for long. The transmission of the me belongs alongside the transmission of lineages. The institutions of civilization and the inheritance of special blood both have to be maintained. Both can be diluted. Both can be renewed. And nowhere is that logic more visible than in the sacred marriage, the yearly union of king and priestess, where ritual power, fertility, legitimacy, and the maintenance of exceptional lineage all come together in one controlled act. In the temple precincts of ancient Uruk, high within the sacred architecture of the Aena complex, a ritual took place that the Sumerians regarded as necessary to order itself. This was not a private devotion, not a hidden superstition, not a marginal rite. It stood close to the center of kingship and cosmic stability. It was the sacred marriage, the union of the king with the goddess, or more precisely, with the high priestess, who embodied the goddess for the duration of the rite. The language surrounding it is explicit. The hymns are not coy. Inanna and Dumuzi speak in sensual agricultural metaphors that are hardly metaphors at all. The body is the field. The plow is the male force. Fertility is the point, and not merely in some abstract heavenly register. The prosperity of the land, the abundance of crops, the legitimacy of rule, the blessing of the city, all are bound to the success of this union. So the king prepares. He is purified, anointed, washed, adorned. He comes to the temple bearing gifts. Music accompanies his approach. The priestess as Inanna receives him. A feast is prepared, offerings are made. And then, in the sacred chamber, the union is consummated. That much is generally accepted. The mainstream interpretation reads the rite as fertility symbolism made public and political. Heaven and earth unite. Divine and human realms are joined. As the king and priestess join, so too seed and soil, rain and field, city and cosmos. The result is abundance. That interpretation is persuasive. It is also incomplete, because not just any man could perform the rite. It had to be the king, and not merely a powerful man who had seized a throne, but the legitimate king, one whose ancestry qualified him to stand in that place. Legitimacy in Mesopotamia always had a genealogical dimension. The king ruled not only because he was strong enough, but because he came from the correct line, the line that had inherited kingship, the line that often claimed divine or semi-divine ancestry. And the priestess, too, did not emerge from nowhere. High cultic offices were often held by women of elite families, royal houses, priestly lines. She was not just symbolically elevated for the ritual. She belonged to a social and hereditary world, already marked as exceptional. This matters because once ancestry becomes central, the sacred marriage can be read not only as symbolic fertility, but as a mechanism of controlled inheritance. If kingship carried divine ancestry, however diluted over time, and if priestly lines carried another concentration of sanctified or elite inheritance, then their union would do more than dramatize cosmic order. It would renew and concentrate a desired lineage. It would preserve what the culture regarded as special blood. That is not a modern biological claim imposed from outside. It is already implied in the Sumerian obsession with descent, with who may rule, with who may serve, with who stands closer to the gods, and who stands further away. The sacred marriage makes that obsession bodily. A culture that believes ancestry matters will inevitably ritualize reproduction among its elites. The rite also dramatizes mutual recognition. In the hymns, Inanna does not passively receive. She chooses desires, summons, adorns herself, evaluates. The king comes not as an anonymous male, but as the selected counterpart. There is reciprocity, worthiness, fit. In modern terms, one might speak of a sortative pairing, the bringing together of lines already regarded as superior in order to preserve or enhance specific traits in descendants. The texts themselves speak of gifts conferred through the union, long life, victory, wisdom, prosperity. In mythic language, these are divine blessings. In another register, they look like inherited or transmitted advantages. The sacred marriage says over and over that the union of these two persons matters because what comes from it is not ordinary. Not every royal child, of course, would necessarily be the product of the rite. Kings had other wives. Dynasties produced many claimants. Succession was often contested. That complexity remains. But complexity does not erase the underlying logic. The ritual annually reaffirmed that the highest possible union king and goddess ruler and sanctified female line was the proper source of legitimacy and renewal. That is a social fact. It may also reflect a biological imagination. Many cultures preserve versions of this pattern. In Egypt, the pharaoh can be described as divinely fathered. In Greek myth, heroes emerge from unions of gods and mortals. In Indian tradition, lineages trace themselves to celestial beings or sages. Again and again, exceptional rulers are explained through mixed ancestry. Not purely divine, not merely human, but both. The Sumerians did not leave this as a distant myth only. They enacted it. Year after year, the union of special blood with sacred embodiment was repeated as state ritual, not as memory alone, but as maintenance. And here, a further possibility enters. The rite may preserve the memory of earlier, more literal crossings between groups understood as different in nature. If the oldest lineages of kingship were believed to descend from unions between ordinary humans and a more powerful, knowledgeable, or simply different population, the beings later called gods, then the sacred marriage would reenact in controlled ritual form the original crossing that created the royal line in the first place. In that sense, the ritual does not merely symbolize divine ancestry. It keeps the memory of divine ancestry alive by replaying its founding logic. Some texts hint as well at pharmacological preparation oils, unguents, carefully prepared substances used in the ritual context. Whether these were simply perfumes and anointing oils or had stronger physiological effects cannot be known with certainty. But ancient ritual cultures often used substances to alter experience, deepen trance, intensify sacred encounter. If so, then the rite would have been experienced not as theater, but as actual crossing, actual communion, actual transformation, actual contact with the divine. And that matters because the Sumerian world does not sharply divide symbol from reality in the way modern analysis often does. A thing can be enacted and real at once. A ritual can symbolize and produce. It can say and do simultaneously. So the sacred marriage may be many things at once: fertility rite, dynastic legitimation, political theater, eugenic memory, controlled renewal of special blood, enactment of divine human union, reactivation of the cosmic order. All of those levels can coexist. What remains consistent across them is the assumption that bloodlines matter, mixture matters, repetition matters. The special inheritance can fade, if not renewed. It can be diluted through time. Therefore, it must be maintained through ritual marriage and the careful ordering of elite reproduction. This is exactly the sort of logic we would expect in a culture that believed some humans possessed more of a divine component than others. And whether that divine component was mythic language for status, for inherited excellence, for archaic ancestry, or for something more mysterious, the structure of the belief remains stable. Some lineages are not the same as others. Some unions matter more than others. Human diversity is not superficial. It is ancestral. That is the frame the texts keep returning to, again and again, through creation stories, through king lists, through Adapa, through the sages, through the me, through ritual. And if all of that were only self-justifying ideology, we could stop there. We could say the Sumerians built an elaborate system for making hierarchy feel natural. Many civilizations have done that. But then modern genetics enters the conversation. And when it enters, something changes. Because for the first time, there is a body of evidence from outside the texts. Cold, statistical, molecular evidence showing that human beings really are composites of multiple ancestral streams, that admixture really has shaped capacities and traits, that our species truly does bear the marks of repeated crossings between distinct populations. And that is where the ancient record begins to feel less like a fantasy and more like a question waiting for a future science to catch up with it. In 2010, a team led by Svante Pääbo published one of the most consequential papers in modern anthropology. They had sequenced the Neanderthal genome. From bones tens of thousands of years old From fragments preserved across impossible spans of time, they reconstructed the genetic code of a human relative, long considered separate from us, closed off from us, gone. And what the sequence revealed was not separation without contact, but contact. Not clean replacement, but interbreeding. Modern humans outside Africa carry Neanderthal DNA. Between 1 and 4% of the genomes of Europeans, Asians, and many oceanic populations derives from Neanderthals. That discovery overturned a comfortable model. For decades, one dominant story held that Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, spread outward, and replaced other archaic populations with little or no significant interbreeding. We would be under that model, one line replacing all others. But the genome said otherwise. Then in 2011, another surprise deepened the picture. DNA from a finger bone found in Denisova Cave in Siberia revealed a previously unknown archaic population, the Denisovans, distinct from Neanderthals, distinct from modern humans. Yet modern humans carry Denisovan ancestry too, especially in Melanesia, where it can reach several percent. Since then, hints of further archaic contributions have appeared in African populations and in deep population models. The human story has become less singular with every passing year. We are not the product of one untouched line. We are in the most literal possible sense admixture, a mosaic species, a braided species, a species shaped by repeated encounters with other human or near-human populations whose genes entered ours and remained there. And those contributions are not trivial. They affect immune response, skin and hair traits, altitude adaptation, metabolism, even aspects of neurobiology. Archaic ancestry is not just ancient decoration hidden in our cells. It helped shape living human variation. Now return to Sumer. Return to the tablets that say humans were made from mixtures. Return to the texts that speak of divine and earthly substances combined. Return to kings described as carrying different fractions of divine ancestry. Return to pre-flood and post-flood populations treated as different in kind. Return to sages not entirely human. Return to ritual systems designed to preserve special bloodlines. Return to the repeated insistence that humanity is composite. The parallel is not exact. It cannot be exact. Ancient scribes did not have sequencing machines. They did not have population genetics, molecular clocks, or evolutionary anthropology. But the deep structure of the idea, the one that matters most, is startlingly similar. Humans are not one pure source. Humans are mixed. Different lineages carry different inheritances. Ancestry affects traits. Some lines preserve more of one source than others. That is now science. And it was also, in another language, Sumerian thought. The most cautious explanation is coincidence. Human beings everywhere invent origin stories involving mixtures, gods, ancestors, flood survivors, exceptional blood. Some ancient story by chance was bound to overlap with modern reality somewhere. Perhaps that is all we are seeing, accidental resemblance. But the Sumerian case feels more specific than that. Again and again, the texts do not merely say humans were created. They say humans were composed, mixed, varied, differentiated by line. Some have more, some have less. The precision of fractions, the concern with repeated admixture, the distinction between earlier and later populations, these are difficult to wave away entirely. And then there is southern Mesopotamia itself. A 2011 study of Iraqi marsh Arabs examined Y chromosome and mitochondrial variation in a population long associated with the wetlands of southern Iraq, near the lands once occupied by Sumerian cities. The study found evidence of a local paternal expansion event dating roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, contemporary with the rise of Sumerian city-states alongside a pattern of stratified ancestry. That does not prove continuity from ancient Sumer in a simple or total sense, but it does support the idea of deep local development layered with multiple ancestral components. In other words, southern Mesopotamia was not genetically simple. It was already in deep time stratified. The texts describe a world of distinct lineages, special families, inherited differences, and repeated mixture. The genetics of the region describe a population history shaped by layered ancestry and expansion. These are not the same statement, but they are not unrelated statements either. What then did the Sumerians know? That depends on what we mean by know. They did not know DNA as a molecule. They did not know chromosomes, alleles, sequencing, inheritance patterns in Mendelian language. But did they know that ancestry matters? Clearly. Did they know that certain traits run in families? Certainly. Did they know that populations differ? Almost inevitably, every ancient society knew it at some level because every ancient society observed it. Did they frame those differences in terms of lineages of greater and lesser mixture? Their texts suggest they did. And if they inherited explanatory traditions from earlier priestly or scribal systems, if the Apkallu tradition is preserving more than pure fantasy, then their account may not rest on observation alone. It may also preserve transmitted theory. Ancient theory, mythic, in language empirical in some of its underlying intuitions. Here the temptation is to leap too far, to ancient astronauts, lost genetic engineers, vanished, super science. But that leap is unnecessary. One does not need extraterrestrials to explain the texts. One only needs to allow that ancient people could make serious observations about breeding heredity and human variation, and that they could preserve those observations in cosmological form. They domesticated animals, they selected for traits, they understood lineage in practical ways. They knew that what you pair affects what appears in offspring. Royal lines, priestly lines, elite lines, these were managed with that sort of logic in mind long before modern biology gave the process another vocabulary. Seen that way, divine blood becomes a cultural term for inherited distinction. Hybrid heroes become ancestral composites. The sacred marriage becomes controlled lineage maintenance. The flood becomes bottleneck memory. The sages become the transmitters of theory and technique. The text becomes neither primitive fantasy nor modern science, but an ancient knowledge system using symbols to organize empirical and inherited realities. Still another question remains. If the convergence with genetics is real, how should we interpret it? How far can we take it before it becomes projection? That is the next step. Because by this point, three broad interpretations begin to appear. Not one, not two, three. Each compelling in some places, each inadequate in others. Each capable of explaining part of the evidence, none capable of solving it completely. And if we are going to take the Sumerian record seriously, we have to move slowly through those possibilities, rather than choosing the most comfortable one too quickly. There are, broadly speaking, three ways to read what the Sumerian texts are doing. The first is the safest. The second is the most balanced. The third is the most radical. And none of them can be dismissed without cost. The first interpretation is pure mythology. Under this reading, the Sumerian accounts are religious and political narratives created to explain the world, justify social hierarchy, and give shape to anxieties about labor, mortality, disaster, and power. Gods create humans because pre-scientific cultures explain origins through intentional beings. Kings claim divine ancestry because political systems need legitimacy. Flood narratives divide time because cultures need dramatic resets. Hybrid heroes magnify royal prestige. There is no biological content here worth taking literally, no record of actual admixture knowledge, only cosmology, symbolism, and ideology. This view has strengths. It asks for no extraordinary assumptions. It fits what scholars often say about mythology in general. It keeps impossible reign lengths where they seem to belong in the register of sacred narrative rather than material fact. It avoids inflating poetry into pseudoscience. And yet it leaves things behind. It does not explain why the texts are as specific as they are about procedures, lineages, and fractions. It does not explain why ancient narratives repeatedly return to composition mixture and differential ancestry, rather than remaining at the simpler level of the gods made us. It does not explain why the flood is so often not merely destruction, but reconstitution. Most of all, it does not explain the uneasy convergence with modern genetics, except by coincidence. Coincidence is possible, but coincidence is not the same as understanding. The second interpretation is encoded wisdom. This reading takes the mythological form seriously, but sees within it genuine knowledge, empirical, inherited, observational, about heredity, social reproduction, human variation, and the management of lineages. The Sumerians did not know genes as we know genes, but they observed that ancestry matters, that traits run in families, that some populations and lines differ in capacities, and that selective pairings shape offspring. They encoded these observations in the language available to them: divine blood, clay, sacred unions, pre-flood sages, hybrid kings, lineages with more or less of the divine component. Under this reading, the texts are not literal records of gods mixing chromosomes, but they are not empty fiction either. They are ancient frameworks for talking about real biological and social patterns. This interpretation has considerable power. It respects the intelligence of the Sumerians without requiring us to believe they had hidden laboratories. It explains why the text can sound both mythical and curiously systematic. It accounts for the convergence with modern genetics, not as perfect anticipation, but as partial alignment, different languages describing related realities. Still, this interpretation also has limits. It requires interpretation at every step, which details encode real knowledge and which are poetic ornament. Does divine blood mean superior lineage, archaic ancestry, elite ideology, or all of these at once? Are the fractions literal in any sense, or simply the rhetoric of graded prestige? The reading is plausible, but never final. It is always translating one system into another. The third interpretation is historical documentation, in however mythologized a form. Here, the texts are taken much closer to face value. The gods were not merely symbols, but another population, human, near human, foreign earlier, more advanced, or simply radically different in knowledge and self-presentation. They encountered the ancestors of the Sumerians. They mixed with them. They taught them. The resulting hybrid lines became kings, sages, priests, heroes. The flood was an actual break in continuity. The texts preserve memories of this contact in cultural language that later readers mistake for fantasy, because we no longer share the original frame of reference. This reading has its own appeal. It honors the self-presentation of the texts as records. It explains the persistent detail about ancestry procedure and transmission. It matches the broad truth that human history is full of admixture and asymmetrical knowledge transfer. It allows the Apkallu to be memories of actual teachers, not inventions after the fact. But it also faces the hardest objections. We do not have direct archaeological evidence in Mesopotamia for a separate godlike population surviving into the historical period. We do not have fossil or genetic confirmation of archaic hominins persisting there late enough to explain the narratives straightforwardly. And whenever this interpretation is handled carelessly, it drifts into speculative systems that explain too much and prove too little. So, where does that leave us? Perhaps in the only honest place with a synthesis. The Sumerian texts are mythology in genre, but not necessarily falsehood in substance. They preserve religious narrative, political ideology, ritual, symbolism, inherited memory, and empirical observation all at once. The gods may be many things at once, deities and cult ancestors, in memory, superior lineages, in ideology, external teachers in tradition, carriers of a once greater inheritance in genealogical thought. The texts need not be either literal science or mere fairy tale. They may be exactly what ancient literate civilizations often produced: layered records, in which real structures of life are preserved in sacred form. That perhaps is why they endure, because they are trying to answer questions that remain our questions. Why do some people seem to inherit capacities others do not? Why do lineages matter? Why do cultures rise so quickly in some periods? Why do flood rupture and memory recur together? Why are humans both one thing and many things one species? Yet obviously composite in origin, modern genetics answers part of that. It confirms that humanity is not genetically pure, that admixture is real, that inherited differences persist across populations. But genetics does not answer what ancient people made of that reality. The Sumerians answer that, or try to, in their own language, with their own categories. And the categories, however foreign they feel, continue to circle the same center. Humans are mixtures. Some inherit more of one source than another. Ancestry matters. Civilization was received. The old world ended, and the new one began with diminished inheritance. Those ideas recur too often, too coherently to be ignored. The safest reading remains possible. Perhaps it is all mythology. The balanced reading remains persuasive. Perhaps it is myth carrying genuine insight. The radical reading remains open, though unproven. Perhaps it is memory of actual contact and actual difference. We cannot close the case. But we can say this: the tablets deserve more seriousness than condescension allows. They are not primitive nonsense. They are not casual fantasies. They are sustained reflections on heredity, origin, hierarchy, memory, catastrophe, and what it means to be human in a world where not all humans or not all ancestors were imagined to be the same. And once that is granted, the final movement of this investigation becomes less about proving one interpretation and more about living with the question that remains. Because the question remains. It remains in the vault. It remains in the clay. It remains in the genes. It remains in the old line about kingship descending a second time, and in the new line of modern science that says our species is the outcome of repeated mixture. The Sumerians said so in their language. we say so in ours. How did they know enough to say it at all? That is the point we have reached. And from here, the conclusion cannot be a neat answer. It can only be a return to the evidence, to the silence around it, to the possibility that an ancient civilization understood something about us that we are only now learning how to phrase. It is quiet again in the vault beneath the museum. The clay tablet remains where it has remained for years, edges-worn surface marked by wedge-shaped signs that have not changed in 4,000 years. The hand that made them is gone. The city that housed that hand is broken. The language is dead, except where scholars coax it back into sound. And still, the marks remain. That matters, because this entire inquiry begins and ends with the stubborn survival of a record, not certainty, not proof in the modern laboratory sense. But record, a human attempt to preserve a claim across time. And what has that record told us? It has told us of creation through mixture, divine blood, and earthly clay, combined not once, only, but in processes, in stages, in variants. It has told us of kings whose ancestries are fractional, whose capacities exceed ordinary expectation, because they are said to come from more than ordinary lines. It has told us of the flood, not just as destruction, but as division before and after one humanity, and then another one world ending, so another can begin. It has told us of sages from the deep who teach writing law, building agriculture, the full packet of civilization. It has told us of rituals designed to renew elite bloodlines. It has told us of a people who repeatedly insisted they were not the true originators of what they possessed. And then modern genetics entered the conversation and said in its own colder language that human beings are in fact composites, that modern populations carry ancestry from multiple distinct source populations, that admixture is not fringe speculation, but established fact, that our species is the product not of purity but of convergence. This does not prove the Sumerians had ancient genetics. It does not prove hidden laboratories in Eridu. It does not prove extraterrestrial visitors, or lost super civilizations, or impossible technologies buried under the alluvium of Mesopotamia. The tablets do not prove those things, and we should not ask them to prove what they do not say. But the tablets do show something extraordinary. They show that the earliest literate civilization we know thought deeply and systematically about mixed origins, differential ancestry, inherited capacity, and the transmission of civilization from prior beings. That is already remarkable. It is remarkable even before modern genetics. It becomes more remarkable after it, because once we know scientifically that we are mosaics, the old texts stop sounding merely decorative. They begin to sound like another way of grappling with the same reality, not the same method, not the same precision, not the same epistemology, but the same reality. Human beings are not simple. We are not singular in origin. We carry traces of crossings we can no longer witness. We inherit histories written into us before we know how to read them. The Sumerians said this by speaking of gods, sages, kings, flood survivors, and sacred blood. We say it through population genomics, admixture models, and ancient DNA studies. The vocabularies differ. The basic tension remains. If that convergence is coincidence, it is one of the most remarkable coincidences in intellectual history. If it is not coincidence, then we face a quieter and more difficult possibility that ancient civilizations could preserve true structures of reality in symbolic language long before they could explain the mechanisms involved. That is not mystical. It is human. People often know more than they can formally justify. Cultures preserve patterns before they can theorize them in modern ways. Agriculturalists understood inheritance before Mendel. Breeders understood selection before Darwin. Navigators crossed seas before fluid dynamics. Ancient record keepers might well have understood lineage mixture and inherited difference at a level sharper than modern assumptions allow. The Sumerians may have known through observation alone. They may have noticed that some capacities run strongly in certain lines. They may have seen that strategic marriages preserve exceptional families. They may have inherited older accounts that linked those observations to remembered populations or semi-divine teachers. They may have encoded all of that in the language of cosmology because cosmology was the language available to them. If so, then the brilliance of the text is not that they anticipated modern science in detail, but that they preserved durable questions and durable insights in form strong enough to survive millennia. That too is a kind of science, though not ours. At the same time, humility is necessary. We do not know who the Apkallu were. We do not know whether memories of real external teachers lie beneath the fish-cloaked imagery. We do not know how much of the king list reflects inherited chronology and how much reflects sacred numerology. We do not know whether the fractions attached to Gilgamesh were intended as genealogical arithmetic or as prestige language. We do not know whether the flood traditions preserve a specific catastrophe or a layered memory of many inundations merged into one. We do not know, and because we do not know, the strongest conclusion is not certainty, it is seriousness. Take the texts seriously. Read them slowly. Let them speak in their own categories before rushing to flatten them into myth on one side or hidden science on the other. Allow the possibility that they are doing several things at once. Allow the possibility that ancient people were capable of complexity. Modern summaries often deny them. That may be the most important lesson here, because the Sumerians did not treat themselves as self-made. They were in their own understanding inheritors. Civilization was given. Knowledge was transmitted. Human form itself was fashioned, revised, mixed, and bounded. They located dignity not in isolated originality, but in carrying forward a received order. That is a profoundly different civilizational posture from ours. We live in an age that celebrates invention, disruption, novelty firsts. Sumer often speaks instead of memory, stewardship, reception, continuity. Whether or not we believe the gods taught them, the fact remains that they believed they had been taught. And perhaps that belief preserved something modern culture still struggles to admit, that whatever else humanity is, we are inheritors before we are innovators. Biologically, culturally, linguistically, technologically, we arrive already formed by prior mixtures, prior histories, prior gifts, prior catastrophes. We do not begin from zero. No one does. And so the tablet in the vault remains more than an artifact. It is a reminder that the oldest questions are not dead, that the first writers were already asking who made us, what we are made of, why some lineages differ from others, and what catastrophe does to inheritance. They did not ask these questions in laboratories. They asked them in temples and archives. They pressed them into clay. The clay survived. The question survived with it. And now, with modern science in one hand and ancient text in the other, We stand in the uncomfortable place where neither hand can fully close around the truth. That discomfort is not failure. It may be the point. Because some records do not exist to settle a matter once and for all. They exist to keep a civilization from forgetting the shape of the question. And the shape of the question here is unmistakable. If humans are mixtures, and they are, if ancestry matters, and it does, if the oldest literate civilization said so in its own way, then what exactly were they preserving? That question remains open. And the more honestly we face its openness, the more the final movement of this investigation becomes not assertion, but contemplation. After kingship descended from heaven a second time. That line returns because it was meant to return. The Sumerians repeated themselves not because they were careless, but because some ideas demand circling. A thing is said and then said again in another form. Not to move faster, but to dwell longer. Not to tighten meaning, but to deepen it. After kingship descended from heaven a second time. After the flood, after the reset, after one order ended and another began. The phrase carries more than chronology. It carries alteration. The world after is not simply the world before restored. Something has changed. Something has been lost or diluted or interrupted. That is the logic running through the king list, through the Apkallu traditions, through the sacred marriage, through the creation narratives themselves. Earlier beings are stronger, stranger, longer lived, closer to the divine source. Later beings inherit traces, not the whole. That is how the texts keep imagining human history as diminishing inheritance. And once you hear that pattern, you hear it everywhere. The sages before the flood are not the scholars after the flood. The kings before the flood do not resemble the kings after the flood. Gilgamesh is not simply an ordinary man with a crown. Adapa is not simply a priest. The first creations in Enki and Ninmah are not all equally viable. The line is always narrowing. The original difference is always fading. This is why the flood matters so much. Not only because floods destroy, floods erase, scatter, reduce. They leave survivors, but not total continuity. They leave memory, but damaged memory. They leave lineages, but thinned lineages. They leave fragments. Fragments. And perhaps that is why the clay tablet itself matters so much as an object. It too is a fragment, not the whole archive, not the whole account, a broken remnant, a surviving shard from a larger body of writing now lost. The medium mirrors the message. What we have inherited is partial, preserved enough to provoke us, not enough to satisfy us. That is the human condition in relation to origins more generally. We do not inherit full memory, we inherit fragments. Genetics gives us one set of fragments. Ancient texts give us another. Archaeology another. None of them alone restores the whole. But each one says in its own way that the story of humanity is layered, mixed, discontinuous, full of crossings and losses and partial survivals. The Sumerians grasped that even if the categories through which they grasped it are foreign to us now, that may be why their account still feels alive. Not because every detail can be defended, but because the structure of the thought remains familiar once translated into modern terms. We too now speak of bottlenecks. We too speak of admixture. We too reconstruct lost populations from traces carried in later genomes. we too try to infer vanished beings from living descendants. We too face the unsettling reality that our ancestors were not one people, but many, and that the boundaries we prefer were crossed long before we had language for them. So perhaps the deepest convergence between ancient text and modern science is not one specific claim. It is a way of seeing humanity itself, not as pure, not as singular, not as self-originating, but as composite, inherited, and difficult to categorize cleanly. What is human then? That question runs beneath everything. The Sumerians never answer it in final terms. Instead, they destabilize it. Humans are made from clay, yes, but also from divine blood. Humans are mortal, yes, but some are closer to the gods than others. Humans inherit civilization, but not from themselves. Humans can be wise, but not immortal. Some figures stand between categories. Some are created, not born. Some are kings, but not quite men. Some are sages, but not quite gods. Humanity in these texts is not a sealed definition. It is a threshold condition. And in a strange way, modern science has done something similar. The old clean categories have weakened. We are Homo sapiens, yes, but we also carry ancestry from lineages once considered separate enough to be other. We are one species, yet not from one source. The genome has made the category of human more continuous and more complicated at the same time. The clay says mixture. The DNA says mixture. The categories differ. The disturbance is shared. That is why the final conclusion cannot simply be that the Sumerians were right or wrong. The more honest conclusion is that they were wrestling with the same basic instability. Modern science has rediscovered that humanity is not an untouched line, but a history of convergences. Whether they arrived at that through observation-inherited lore or symbolic imagination is the unresolved part. But the central perception remains impressive. They understood that we are the result of crossings. They understood that what comes down through blood matters. They understood that catastrophe interrupts transmission. They understood that knowledge too can be inherited, lost, and only partially recovered. Perhaps that is the real meaning of the sages. Perhaps the Apkallu are not only strange beings from before the flood, but emblems of a fear every civilization has, that essential knowledge can vanish, and that what survives afterward may survive only in damaged form. If so, then the stories of fish-cloaked teachers emerging from the deep are also stories about archive and loss, about the fragility of continuity, about the need to hand things on before waters rise. And that too feels modern. We like to imagine ourselves secure in our data, our networks, our storage systems, our backups, our laboratories. Yet all of that is more fragile than it seems. Ancient people knew fragility intimately. They wrote on clay, not because clay was elegant, but because clay endured when other things did not. They knew floods come, cities fall, languages die. What you want preserved you press into durable matter and hope someone later can still read. Someone later did read, and now here we are, centuries and empires and religions and sciences removed, listening to an old voice that still insists on saying the same unsettling thing: you are not from one source only. You come from mixture. You carry forgotten inheritances. The old world survives in you, but not wholly, not purely, not transparently, in traces, in lineages, in remnants. That claim does not become less powerful because we can phrase it scientifically now. It becomes more powerful because now the ancient thought has a second witness. The question then is no longer merely whether the Sumerians guessed correctly. The question is what it means for us that they were already asking, already preserving, already circling the problem in language meant to endure. And the answer to that may not be scientific at all. It may be civilizational. It may be that the oldest literate people left us not certainty about origin, but a discipline of attention. Look at inheritance. Look at mixture. Look at what survives catastrophe. Look at the forms by which memory travels forward. Look carefully. Look again. And when a text returns to the same question, do not always assume repetition means ignorance. Sometimes repetition means the thing was too important to say only once. The clay is cool in imagination because it must remain cool in reality. Behind glass, beneath controlled light, in the quiet of the museum vault, CBS 10673 waits with the patience of fired earth. It does not hurry. It does not argue. It does not announce what it means. It simply remains there, bearing marks made by someone who believed that what was being written down deserved to outlast a human life. That belief was justified. The writer is gone. The language is gone from daily speech. The city is gone in the form it once had. The temple economies, the kings, the scribal schools, the ritual processions, the river routes, gone, or changed beyond easy recognition. But the marks remain. And because the marks remain, the question remains. Why did the Sumerians write as if humanity had different origins? Why did they preserve creation accounts based on mixture genealogies, based on fractional ancestry, flood traditions that separate one humanity from another? Traditions of sages who teach civilization from outside ordinary human society, and rituals meant to maintain special bloodlines. Why did they think this way so consistently, so insistently, so structurally? We do not know completely. Perhaps the answer is simple. They were myth makers, and myth naturally reaches for gods, floods, and special blood. Perhaps the answer is more subtle. They observed real patterns in heredity and human difference, then encoded those observations in sacred language. Also, possible, perhaps the answer is stranger still, they inherited memories, damaged but durable, of real contacts, real teachers, real differences among ancient populations that later generations could only describe as divine. That possibility remains open, though unproven. The point is not to force certainty where certainty does not exist. The point is to recognize that the old texts and the new science now stand near each other in a way that is difficult to ignore. Modern genetics has established that humans carry different ancestral contributions. That part is no longer speculative. It is fact. We are mosaics. We are layered. We are bearers of multiple lineages converged into one living species. That is true whether we find it beautiful or unsettling. And the Sumerian record says in its own far older way, yes. Humans are mixtures. Some inherit more from one source, some from another. The old world survives in the new world through lineages, through blood, through remnants. Civilization itself is inherited, not freshly invented. We are shaped by what came before us and by who came before us. That is close enough to modern truth to demand attention. Your genome carries the evidence now, not metaphorically, literally. If you are alive today, you are the surviving meeting point of ancient populations, You are the continuation of crossings no one living witnessed. Your body is an archive of forgotten encounters. Your inheritance is not singular. It never was. The Sumerians did not have that language. They had clay and stylus. They had kings and gods and floods. They had the categories available to them. And with those categories, they tried to say something about what humanity is not one thing only, but a composite. Not pure, but layered. Not self-originating, but made, or at least shaped through mixtures and transmissions, extending backward beyond ordinary memory. In that sense, the old texts do not merely describe the past. They describe you. Not in every detail, not in every theological claim, but in the deepest structural insight, yes. They describe you, a being made of multiple ancestries, an inheritor of lineages you cannot fully name, a carrier of old admixtures still present in living form, a human being whose origin is more complicated than a single line. And perhaps that is why the old clay still speaks. Not because it gives us final answers, but because it recognizes us. Across 6,000 years, across dead languages and broken tablets and modern sequencing machines, it still recognizes the basic fact that we are composites. The Sumerians did not solve the puzzle of human origin. Neither have we. They posed it in one language. We pose it in another. They wrote of divine blood and clay. We speak of admixture and archaic DNA. They told stories of sages from the deep and kings with unusual inheritance. We publish papers on population structure and introgression. The methods differ. The hunger beneath them is the same. Who made us? Where did we come from? Why are we the way we are? Why do some inherit what others do not? How much of our past survives in us? Those are old questions, older than empires, older than philosophy in its formal sense, older than science in our sense. The clay preserves not only one civilization's answers, but one civilization's willingness to keep asking. That may be the greatest gift these texts offer, not closure, not proof, not certainty, but permission to remain with the complexity, to admit that our origins may be richer and stranger than the clean narratives we prefer, to admit that ancient people may have seen more than we usually grant them, to admit that myth and knowledge are not always enemies, and to admit that human identity at the deepest level may be something composite by nature, something forged from multiple sources layered through time, never wholly reducible to one beginning. The tablet is still there, the words are still there, and now you are here at the end of this long path through clay, flood, bloodline, sage, king ritual, and genome. You have followed the question as far as the surviving evidence allows, not to the end of certainty. There may be no such end, but to the edge where ancient text and modern science look for a moment in the same direction. That is enough to matter, enough to disturb, enough to linger. So let the final thought be simple and let it return once more, because some thoughts deserve to return. The Sumerians said humanity came from mixture. Modern genetics says humanity came from mixture. Whatever else separates those two statements, the convergence remains. The vault is quiet. The clay endures. The question remains written in old signs and new sequences alike. And the answer incomplete but undeniable. is already in you. You are the inheritor of ancient mixtures. You are the carrier of forgotten legacies. You are not from one source only. You never were. The scribes are gone, but what they pressed into clay survives. The archaic populations are gone, but what they left in human DNA survives. The old world ended, and yet it did not end entirely. It continues in fragments, in records, in genomes, in questions that refuse to die. That is what the tablet preserves. That is what the science confirms. That is what remains when the narration falls silent. Sleep then with that thought if you wish, not with certainty, but with depth. Not with a closed case, but with an opened inheritance. The clay is patient. The blood remembers. And somewhere between them, humanity continues to ask what it is.